Welcome, everyone, and good morning. Most of you will have noticed that as you walk in this room, you pass by an exhibition by the students of the School of Visual Arts. Every single poster in that exhibition refers to the merits of philanthropy and incorporates quotes from poetry, literature, philosophy, and popular culture. You get their quotes from Walt Whitman to Gandhi to rock stars. So, in general, it is widely accepted that philanthropy is something inherently good, right? And this doesn't only hold for popular culture or such sorts of expressions about philanthropy, it also holds about a more austere, rigorous approach to the discipline of philosophy. So, utilitarianism holds that the proper course of action is the one that maximizes utility, the latter defined as maximizing the total benefit for everyone, let's say, for instance, via the alleviation of pain and the reduction of suffering. Given that part of the mission of philanthropic giving is to reduce suffering, one can say that philanthropic giving is supported by a utilitarian outlook to life. Nevertheless, there are political ethical theories like John Rawls's theory, who are actually a response to utilitarian disciplines that also allow for philanthropic giving, and they implicitly say that it is something that is worthwhile. So in John Rawls's theory, in his second principle, the principle of fairness, in his book Theory of Justice, he says he puts great weight on the idea of equal opportunity and the idea of promoting the greatest benefit for the most least advantaged people in society. The Stavros Niarchos Foundation initiatives of recharging the youth that try, in a way, to promote equal opportunity, and the Foundation's €100 million initiative to alleviate the pain of the economic crisis in Greece fit perfectly within Rawls's theory. So overall, we can agree that philanthropy, prima facie, it's something good. So this panel is not going to focus so much on the question of whether philanthropy is ethically good or not. This panel will focus mostly on ethical questions that philanthropic practice and charitable giving face on a daily basis, but are rarely discussed explicitly, either because of the pressure of daily management of philanthropic giving or because sometimes they are too difficult to face. So, for instance, some of the questions we will deal with have to do with how does one deal with the maze of seemingly worthwhile but often conflicting values that can be promoted through philanthropic giving? What are the challenges posed by cultural relativism, and how can one practice philanthropic giving in different geographical contexts or even within different groups within a single society? To what extent do ethical concerns are important in the daily practice of philanthropy? These are the questions that we will mainly focus today, and some others, and I give the floor to Nancy, who will kickstart this session.
Thanks, Panos, and thanks so much to everyone at the Niarchos Foundation who has been so lovely and gracious from the moment we were invited through all of the arrangements. So I think most of us on the panel have decided we wanted to come up here. It allows us to see you a little better. What I want to do in my short time is build on what Panos did and introduce a few ethics principles, and then I'm just going to raise a couple of ethics questions associated with each of those principles in the context of philanthropy. Like what Panos said, I am not going to take on the question of whether philanthropy is good. I'm going to go with the assumption that it's a moral good to be kind to others, to help others, and that philanthropy is an extension of that. But the questions I raise, which again are a very small sample of the kinds of questions that could be raised under each of the headings, will take on more the question of ethically how should philanthropy be done. So I'm going to use an incredibly simple kind of ethics framework and raise 4 principles that in any kind of interaction we might want to follow from an ethics perspective. So the first of these principles is that we should be doing good, and part of that means avoiding harm. The second principle is we should be respectful to other people. People come from really different traditions and values, and sometimes what we think is important isn't always what other people think is important. The third is that we should be fair and be mindful to justice and what does fairness mean to different kinds of populations. And the last more comes from a tradition of professional ethics, which means we should always act with integrity. And again, what that means is going to be hard to define, but is critical to define for each of us in our own identities. So what does it mean to do good through philanthropy? Do we calculate the good of philanthropy by measuring how much money was given, or by measuring how much was achieved? And then when we think about the parallel duty to do no harm, we again will assume that nobody who does philanthropy, and let's assume very few people in the world, are trying to do harm, exactly the opposite. But what kind of work do we do to investigate what the potential unintended consequences are of the philanthropic programs we implement? And anything can have unintended consequences, and I'm sure many of us have our own examples, but take, for example, a women's micro-lending program, which could increase women's financial independence, but somehow inadvertently could also increase the risk of violence against women. Or programs that are intended to send children to school could inadvertently reduce government commitments or expenditures to children, ultimately resulting in fewer children going to school in the long run. So trying to be accountable for whether one's philanthropy is achieving the intended outcomes and avoiding important unintended consequences maybe becomes an ethically important exercise. It raises what kind of upfront engagement and measurement is important before implementing a program, and then thinking about how measurement and maybe constituency engagement can become morally required when implementing certain kinds of programs. And again, this means measuring not only the intended outcomes and the degree to which they were met. For example, again, the number of women who took up loans and whether they repaid them, but also funding as part of the philanthropic gift, creative forms of measurement to figure out what the unintended consequences might have been, and again, devoting care to answering whether or not we're doing good. So this next principle of respect, again, there are primary duties of respect that we all have: to be respectful to each other, to be kind to each other, to walk with humility in relation to all people. But again, other aspects of respect may be more difficult. So my own background is in public health, and we're always navigating a difficult ethical tension in public health around this question of respect. We have questions in public health about what's the right balance between being paternalistic, implementing a program that we know is good for other people, and respecting the values that they bring and allowing them to make the choices that they think are best for them. So we might in public health think that it's ethically appropriate to pass a law requiring people to wear seatbelts in their cars, and indeed in the United States many such laws have been passed. But there's always been a constituency that says, well, tell people about the importance of seatbelts and leave the choice to them. So in philanthropy, we might encounter the same tensions between paternalism, having a sense of what's best for a community, and respect, allowing people to articulate themselves what they think is best. There clearly is a tension in philanthropy in figuring out who gets to set the agenda and who decides what money will be used for. So again, to throw in another example from my own experience, for the last 14 years through my own work at Johns Hopkins, I've been helping to run a program that's funded by something called the Fogarty International Center to train people from Africa in bioethics, particularly around ethics in research. There's more and more public health research going on in Africa to prevent things like HIV and malaria and tuberculosis. And important as these studies are, and I'm a deep believer in their importance, there are often ethics questions that emerge in these studies to make sure that people aren't exploited, that people understand the research, that benefits really come out of the research enterprise. And it's critically important for people from the local environments to be trained in ethics. So when we started this program 14 years ago, and I made my first trip to Africa to meet with African leaders from universities, from malaria NGOs, et cetera, 3 different people in 3 different places sort of chuckled and made some joke in a first meeting about, oh, we know about the golden rule. The people who bring the gold make all the rules. And by the time the 3rd person said this to me with a little chuckle, I thought, okay, I'm hearing a real message here. This is not just a friendly joke to get us going. This is something that we really have to pay attention to when we come in with something that we think is an important program. So not only do we need to think about respect in setting the agenda, but also in the conditions of the giving. So respect is important, and we care about what other people think and what they value. But presumably, as someone coming in, we also have our own values. And it's important to think through in advance what those values are and which ones we're willing to compromise on and which ones we're not. So it may be a condition of the funding to say that women have to be hired in equal numbers, or that women have to be served in equal numbers, or that we won't tolerate discrimination with regard to ethnicity, or to put out what's such a hot button issue right now with regard to sexual orientation. And there will be some values that we'll stick with and some we won't, and I'm obviously not going to take a position on which ones are right, but to have a conversation in advance about which values are non-negotiable and which values aren't, and then to have it written down and have it be a policy not only is important for what signifies the ethical values of the funder, but also in moving to this next principle of fairness, conveys a sense of fairness, that this is not being targeted to a particular group or program, but is really what the funder stands for. So moving on to this third principle of justice or fairness, there is a lot of discussion that I've already heard in the short time I've been here about the justice questions that emerge in deciding what to fund, arts versus social welfare, or which populations, or whether to target those who are the least well off, in this Rawlsian principle. But I want to just raise a different kind of ethics justice question, certainly not one that I'm prepared to answer, which is what's the appropriate relationship between philanthropy and the state? And what both ought to be the right relationship between philanthropy and government? And then what's the right relationship when government sometimes fails with taking on the responsibilities that we might think in an ideal world government should be responsible for? So again, in the country that I come from, the United States, there are tax incentives given for philanthropy. And there's a lot of very important reason for that, but there's a group of people who think that that's inappropriate in terms of what that communicates about the role of the state. If you're in a context where you feel like government has not fulfilled all of its responsibilities with regard to things like providing basic food, housing, education, or healthcare, again, is the right role for philanthropists to come in and try to fill in the gaps and help to provide some of those programs? Or is it more for philanthropy to get involved in pushing the government, being the nudge for the government in doing the things that perhaps the government should be doing through different philanthropic trends of doing things like voter turnout, democracy promotion, or avoidance of corruption? And then the last principle I just want to introduce is that of integrity. And many foundations have policies to promote integrity, have policies with regard to their own governance structure, policies with regard to transparency. There's a foundation called Glass Pockets, which devotes itself to helping foundations think about things like transparency and improve their policies and think about all the ways in which they could be transparent. But again, the form of integrity that I'd like to discuss is integrity to one's own core values and mission. And this is the place where I want to diverge from thinking about the ethics issues that the philanthropist faces to the ethics issues that the recipient might face. There are some kinds of issues that I think are more widely talked about, what some people call tainted money, or would I take money from this group? The School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins made a decision a while ago to never take money from a tobacco company. That's a decision that has to do with what are my core values and what does the funder stand for. But I think the harder issues are not ones where you worry about the politics or mission of the funder in that tobacco kind of sense, but more when I, as a recipient, have my own values and mission, and what the philanthropist is interested in will take me off course, will take me off mission. And I start to have a potential conflict of interest where the influx of funds will be really important for my organization. But starting to diverge from my own mission becomes challenging. And it again is, when I've experienced any kind of ethical tension like that, it just reiterates to me this importance, which we've talked about as a panel informally, of having some kinds of principles and values to stand by as a recipient organization, as well as presumably as a philanthropist, to get a sense of what our own ethical identity is and how we can try to stay true to that and when we're willing to waver. So I'm going to end with those thoughts and questions and maybe turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Nancy. So, Jeff, which values are we willing to compromise and which values are we not willing to compromise?
Yes. Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to be here as well, and I want to thank the organizers for the invitation and the very interesting topics of the days. So I'm going to do my best in the very few minutes that we each have so that we can actually talk as a panel and hear from you all to really raise some questions. One of the benefits of talking for 5 or 7 minutes is you don't have to provide answers, just ask more questions. So I will do that. The context in which I am going to focus my remarks is on the issue that in moral philosophy, and my background is as a philosopher, that we know in the application practically of thinking about ethical issues that people in different societies or at different times in history make moral judgments that seem to be at odds, or at least different, with those from another place or time. And philosophers call this the problem of moral relativism, that morality seems relative to time or to place or to culture. And we heard a little bit about that, in fact, in Panos' introductory remarks and also Nancy's, and I'll say more about that in a second. So the focus that I want to take is actually on one part of this problem of moral relativism, and that is the aspect of relativism related to culture. That morality sometimes appears to be relative to the culture in which people are living and in the decision-making among those people. So right and wrong in one culture's behavior, and we assume that their behavior reflects their understanding, their commitments to values, to the kinds of principles that Nancy articulated, and the relative importance of those principles within that culture is different from one culture to another. So it's a sort of descriptive observation that seems to be the case. So just to be a little bit practical about this, in the areas in which I work, and Nancy and I work together in biomedical ethics, or bioethics more generally, the challenge of this sort of cultural relativism is evident in examples like how we discuss the beginnings and ends of life, how we think about the use of animals in research, and in emerging areas of science such as embryonic stem cell research. So what is acceptable and policies made in one culture is actually different than they are in another. And so the question then is, whose ethics should govern? Should we allow what seems to be this difference? This is a really important ethical issue when the choices of a philanthropic organization are faced in crossing cultural boundaries or societal borders. And we'll talk more about this as a panel. To bring this home, I happened upon some very recent and interesting research that shows that these differences are influenced by a somewhat unexpected factor, which is quite relevant, I think, to our discussion together today, which is that of language, the language that individuals speak. So researchers in 2 different parts of the world, Boaz Kazar at the University of Chicago and Albert Costa in Barcelona at the Center for Brain and Cognition Research, took on a very interesting approach to a standard philosophical question and asked people to answer questions about the ethical duties that they perceived as appropriate depending on their native language, the language in which they were asked the question. So the research focused on what is known in philosophy as the trolley problem. I'll describe what that is. The trolley problem is well known to moral philosophers. People are asked what you would do in the following hypothetical situation. And I know we're going to be using clickers later. It would be an interesting time to test this out on you all, although I don't think we're going to do that today. So here's the question for you all. You're standing on a footbridge, a bridge over a set of train tracks. And an approaching trolley is coming down the tracks out of control, a streetcar. And approaching 5 people further down the track that will be killed if the trolley continues on its path. The only way to stop the train from killing those 5 people is for you to push a large man standing with you on the bridge off the bridge onto the tracks below so that it will stop the train and prevent the 5 from dying. But in the process, of course, the 1 will be killed. So what would you do? I'm not asking you to answer that question. Surprisingly, the response when people are asked that question varied in the following way. The individuals who were in the research project spoke either English or Spanish as a first language. And they were then randomly assigned to hear the hypothetical question I just offered to you in either their native language or the language that they knew as a foreign language. So they were either native speakers of English studying Spanish or native speakers of Spanish studying English. In their native language, so here's the interesting outcome, in their native language, only 18% said they would push the man off the bridge, but in their foreign language, 44% said they would push the man off the bridge. So more than double, almost half the people switched over. Similar results were found in other foreign languages, so it wasn't just English-Spanish combination that yielded this result. The researchers did the same experiment in native speakers of Korean, Japanese, Hebrew, English, and Spanish. That was the combination. So how to explain what seems to be a desire to protect and respect individuals, one individual, even at the expense of the many, so the 5, when doing so is when it's asked of you in your native tongue, but to embrace what seems to be a utilitarian approach, save the 5, but sacrifice the 1 when you're asked in a foreign language. The researchers say that, effectively quoting a very famous person who just passed away, Nelson Mandela, this is the answer. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head, so the foreign language. But if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. The idea being that when you speak to somebody in their native language, they react more emotionally, and when you talk to them in their foreign language, they process more from their brain. This has quite significant, I would say, implications for philanthropy, for how we think about assessing the values, priorities, goals from an ethics perspective of individuals in a society, in particular for philanthropic organizations working across borders. So the take-home in that particular example is that a framework for how to think about the ethical implications of philanthropy on the part of donors is certainly critical. Even more so, it turns out, my last little comment about this, that the research showed that when the example is a stressful one, when individuals are told it's an emergency and you must decide quickly, do you push the man off the bridge or not, they react in the way that I mentioned. If you give them an example that I won't go into detail because of time, that allows them a little more thought about it, they react much more utilitarian. So under conditions of stress, the reactions are much more notable in the difference between native versus foreign language. And that's an important take-home, I think, given so much of the discussion of the last day and today is about what to do in conditions of real stress upon societies. So I think with that, given the timing, I should stop, even though there's much more to say, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk together on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Great implications of philanthropy there. Martyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you too for the kindness shown to me by the organisers of the conference. Ethics are the moral principles that govern an organisation's behaviour or conduct, and defining and applying an ethical perspective to the whole of philanthropy is a daunting undertaking, as I think Jeff was demonstrating. It is an overwhelming task to figure out what ethical values human beings share across our differences of race, religion, ethnicity, national identity, and material wealth. Now, I work very closely with the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, and Joel Rosenthal, their president, has initiated an ambitious 3-year project called Reimagining a Global Ethic. And this project will further Andrew Carnegie's original goal in founding all 20 Carnegie institutions which was to improve well-being and reduce the amount of conflict and violence in the world. However, there is no current commonly agreed ethic or set of ethics that governs philanthropy. Let me give you a view of what really governs philanthropy. Money is at the heart. Both giving money and spending money. It's not the only thing, but it's critical. So what are the building blocks that govern philanthropic behavior? The first is legal privilege, awarded by the political system. The privileges are most commonly tax advantages. The second building block is responsibility, which is enforced by regulation. That regulation might be external, a charity commission, or self-regulation, or indeed both. The third building block is confidence of the public in philanthropy and charity. Generally, this is high, but poor reputation of a single charity or philanthropic activity damages us all. When these building blocks are positive, then the reputation of the sector and philanthropy are improved. These building blocks provide what I call the discipline for philanthropy. Different jurisdictions shape the building blocks differently. The result is within each jurisdiction and in between jurisdictions, there's pluralism of outlook, purpose, and activity. Now, I consider this disciplined pluralism essential to the health of philanthropy and charity. There is a view that there is a distinction between philanthropy and charity. Some say philanthropy takes this big strategic view and charity offers a sticking plaster. I certainly don't agree with that. Again, the real distinction to my mind comes down to money. Big amounts of money give you power. Small amounts of money give you influence. And philanthropy offers big amounts of money. The average charitable donation in the UK, charitable donation, is €10 a month, given by roughly half the population. There were only 180 philanthropists in the UK that gave more than €1 million. They had real power. In some ways, the surprise here is who gives this €1 million a year or more. In some ways, the great surprise to me is not that it's individuals who give the most, but actually how little corporations give in philanthropic giving in terms of the total. That small number give over €1 million. This represents the €11 billion given by charity, by the small donations. This is the contribution of philanthropy. I put it there in order that we don't overestimate the contribution of philanthropy to this whole world of giving. The next comparison is, this is government spending, again in the UK, about €1,000 billion a year. This is a contribution of both philanthropy and charity. Again, trying to demonstrate, let's not overstate the contribution that philanthropy and charity makes to public expenditure. Now, of course, we should be concerned about where philanthropic money goes to. And so that's where you expect it to go to, overseas aid, health, and other. But there's 42% left. So where does that 42% go? It goes to universities. It is really interesting that those who have power, which is, if you have philanthropy, you have power, give a significant amount of their donations to the knowledge institutions of our societies. And I think that raises significant ethical questions for universities in particular. These are the defensive actions we take in philanthropy to protect our reputation: transparency, public benefit, and compliance. And when these are in sync, it increases our reputation and therefore increases the trust in donations to us and philanthropy in general. But we have to act more. We can retrench, we can restructure, we can reform, or we can rethink. Our own charity has chosen to rethink our mission, to change from consensus seeking to thought leadership, to change to a focus on partnership and working with those who may not agree with us. Our charity was very good at answering this exam question: what is your foundation good at? We said we're good at research. That wasn't the question that we should have been asking ourselves. The question is, what are we good for? What added value do we bring? My final contribution is this. The wicked issues of the 21st century can only be resolved, in my view, by civil society, government, and business working in cooperation. At the centre there can be impact. The advantage of philanthropy, it has convening power and the resources to bring those parties together and therefore have significant impact on those issues that the world suffers from. Thank you.
Thank you, Martyn. You appropriately mentioned corporations in that presentation, which sets the floor for Chris to talk to us about ethical issues that are faced when philanthropy deals with corporations.
Thank you. Good morning. A slight confession that the last time I did any public speaking wasn't in somewhere as lovely as this. It was in a refugee camp in East Africa at a women's centre. And I'm a little nervous because after saying something very sincere and appropriate, or what I thought was, the only question from the audience was an old lady at the back who stuck her hand in the air and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Bald Man, would you marry my sister?" So I hope the questions that you raise are a little bit better than that, and I should be fine. So firstly, it's my pleasure to be taking part in the conference and as a guest of the foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about corporate philanthropy, about the intersection between Oxfam and multinationals in particular. But before I do, I'll quickly mention who Oxfam are, because I know that many people might not have heard of us. Oxfam, last year we helped 15 million people benefit in over 90 countries from development programs, from humanitarian responses, and for campaigning for change. From the Philippines typhoon, where we're supporting 750,000 people and with the support of the foundation, to our work challenging governments to implement an arms trade treaty. Coming to Athens is actually a homecoming for Oxfam. Our first response back in 1942 was to the Nazi occupation of Greece to support displaced people. So we were actually born here. I'm going to speak, as we said, about ethics. And to me, in my experience, ethics is intimately linked to power. As the world changes around us at lightning speed and as power balances shift and shape around us, so too Oxfam must change from just a service provider, people who dish out, say, malaria nets or hygiene kits, to also an influencer, putting power in the hands of the poor and giving them a voice to shape decisions, change power structures and challenge inequality. We're adapting and addressing the structural issues of poverty at an ever-increasing scale. This brings the ethics of our transactions and our relationships and ties into sharp focus, where the lines between those with power and influence converge at the very heart of our mission. Like any other organisation, we need resources to achieve the principal aim of giving people rights and often saving their lives. But those resources are concentrated in the hands of the relatively few and can sometimes be held by the very people we need to see change most. Those are the corporates, the institutions and the governments. Corporate engagement is one of those areas where there is a nexus, the competing agendas of multinationals to gain power and resources, land, water, labour, to prove to the myriad of shareholders that they can outcompete the competition, grow value, profitability, acquire competitive advantage and hold governments' feet to the flames with the law of inward investment, versus our desire in civil society to influence them to have a pro-poor agenda, and at the same time, unfortunately, in the contradiction, access their resources, their money, their infrastructure, their influence and their knowledge. If you take the global food industry as an example, less than 500 companies control 70% of the world's food production. There are 1.5 billion food producers on the planet, most of which are smallholder subsistence farmers living in chronic and debilitating poverty. Allied to this, there are approximately 450 million people who are in waged labour roles within the system, and up to 60% of those are living in poverty, whilst at the same time increasing the yields and the dividends of the big global food corporations. Wave after wave of investigative reporting, particularly recently, has highlighted the realities on the ground, whether it's tea pickers on the tea estates in Sri Lanka, the devastating Rana Plat's tragedy in Bangladesh, and the recent report exposing slave labour in Thailand's fisheries supply chain. These are products ultimately ending up on consumers' shelves in supermarkets. But facts, figures and reports, damning as they are, can be applied to every industry on the planet. The inequality game that the planet plays is as fierce now as it has ever been, and if you look on every high street, in every shopping mall, you'll see companies and charities enmeshed in symbiotic relationships, fair trade marks, on-pack endorsements, charity tins. The public face of these relationships is only one element of a myriad of exchanges happening across the space: public-private partnerships, collaboration in the field, employee engagement and sponsorship of events, product development, testing, grant proposals going back and forth before a staff vote. It's far from uncommon to see charities stood waiting in the reception of a major firm before being called in to pitch to the board for Charity of the Year, in the same selection process that you'd find for an ad agency or an IT supplier. And I know because I've stood there many times and started to stress and panic about whether we'll win their favour or not. Some would rightly argue that for Oxfam to assert its influence over the actions and activities of a powerful machine, the policies and the practice of these multinationals, there needs to be a very clear firewall between the civil society organisation and the profit-hungry multinational. Simply put, some people would say, do not take their money. The argument can be justified along many lines. Some might argue it is tainted or robbing Peter to pay Paul. Why take money from a structure that has exasperated poverty to simply apply that money to a problem elsewhere? If you take their money, it's a form of commercial hush money, an attempt to publicly align with you, the NGO, in order to procure your goodwill and your brand benefits and avoid your criticism. Some would argue that the very notion of corporate philanthropy doesn't exist. How can something without a conscience make anything other than a rational choice to meet its strategic agenda? I was reminded of a phrase recently of a friend who sits in this camp, and he said, I think it's a quote from somebody else, but he said, corporations have no soul to damn and no body to kick. Are we, the NGO, being naive in accepting the benevolence of a multinational under the illusion it cares, shares our mission and shares our values? The most compelling argument against the case for acceptance is always that influencing a multinational's policies and practice must take precedent. If they need to change, that must come first. Without that direction of travel in place, a financial relationship cannot be justified. Other opinions within the NGO sector fall in extremis at the other end of the spectrum. They would argue that business and morality are mutually exclusive, or accepting donations from an organisation's charity committee or foundation is fundamentally distinct from the dark arts of its core business or its PR machine. They might argue that multinationals have achieved far more than any NGO in eradicating poverty. Who are we to claim the moral high ground when they've proved their model far more successful than our own? They're being lazily characterised as evil, despite Google's claim to the contrary. One of the most compelling arguments I heard was from a beneficiary, a discussion with a young chap at a water point that we installed in Kenya. And he pointed to the people queuing for the water, and he said, right now, these people need to survive. These companies you mentioned, they've never heard of them. They don't care. They just want to survive. His argument fell somewhere between the curse of knowledge and the immediacy of people's needs have when they're living on the edge of existence. And that's a world away from the debates at this conference and from the financial capitals of Europe and the US. In respect of youth and employment, there are many here today. Some of you will be the donor, the representative of your corporate foundation, from the corporate themselves. Some will be from civil society looking to build networks, as I am, and build capacity of your own programs. Each and every one of us has a point of view falling somewhere on the spectrum between absolutely no and, of course, yes. And the challenge becomes this. Is the multinational conglomerate a hero or a villain? Can anyone take a binary approach to those sorts of engagements? Can you separate philanthropy or benevolence from the actions and activities of a business as a whole? I know of one multinational food company, I won't name, but who seek convergence to learn and to be challenged. They've said on a number of occasions that the influence of those they engage with to improve their standards are far more impactful than shouting from the sidelines. Their argument being, we know we're not perfect, but we're trying. Encourage us to change with the carrot and not the stick. They're blessed, as it happens, with a really progressive CEO, but there are many others who aren't in such a position. Looking through the lens of youth and employment, to the donors, I'd argue, within your core business, are you doing everything you can to build the case for fostering the talents of the youth? Does your board believe it, and does it drive forward that agenda because it recognises it has a social contract? Will that culture and that purpose outlive your CEO? Does it pay lip service to the issue, or have they stood at the AGM and declared growth at any cost is not acceptable? I'd argue that only then should you build upon what exists to complement those activities with grants to partners, for instance. To those from civil society, please choose your bedfellows carefully, not just on the size of their purse, but take as critical and as cynical view as the donor as they do of you. It's not just your right to do so, but I believe it's necessary to preserve the distinction between profit and social justice. So what of Oxfam? Well, of course, we take our due diligence seriously, and something that a team of us are charged with looking at, and we put every effort within our capabilities to put the rights of poor people first. But we're not binary. We know that insider influence is as powerful as shouting from the sidelines, so we engage at a programme and a policy level. And we accept funds from roughly a third of multinationals that we screen. But we're not naive. We invite expert consultation on areas that potentially contradict our mission. Our test of engagement begins with one sentiment, and there's a whole process behind this. But the question that we ask ourselves, and it's very easy to ask, and we're in a situation where it's very difficult often to evaluate, but we're in a different position than some in that we have to make a decision. If we're faced with a humanitarian crisis or a long-term development program, one of the things we have to do in this ethical space is make a decision. The question that we ask ourselves at the start is this: does the donor substantially or willfully undermine our cause? We look forensically at what we've coined the 5 Ps: a company's policies, its practice, its products, its processes, and finally its principles. We don't take the decisions lightly, and when push comes to shove, we always retain the right to walk away or to criticise them publicly and privately. As a consequence, we don't generate, as Martyn said, we don't generate income from the corporate sector to the same degree as some of our peers, but we continuously try to walk the path between principles and pragmatism to the best of our abilities. We're dealing with the concept that I've actually uncovered during the course of this conference, I didn't know it had a name, of incommensurable values. On each relationship, how do you compare, for instance, the grant being offered of $1 million to an education program in the DRC to the fact that the donor doesn't pay a living wage to its workers? The same challenge faces civil society in Europe. The policies of governments and markets that may have led or exacerbated to the chronic shortage of opportunities for young people versus the grants available directly for them, for you to do your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for this very sincere presentation that touched on very difficult issues that have to do with the trade-off between principles and pragmatism. Susan will talk to us about the capabilities approach, which is an ethical theory, and how it guides practical decisions.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Panos, for provocative questions. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to, as Panos said, I'd like to propose the capabilities approach as a framework for thinking about the ethical dimensions of philanthropy. Capabilities is an international human development model that's associated with the economist Amartya Sen and the philosopher Martyn Nussbaum. First, I should say that we come to the capabilities approach not as experts on ethics, but we are social researchers who do empirical work on the value of the arts and culture in everyday life. So we view the arts from the lens of social justice, and we're looking at issues of social inclusion, equitable community development, and broader social well-being. So, but we thought it would work for the panel because we think our use of the capabilities approach to ground our research could contribute to a discussion of how ethical theory might inform actual practice of philanthropy. So at the core of the capabilities is a question. What are people actually able to do and to be? What real opportunities are available to them? The simplicity of this question, says Martyn Nussbaum, indicates that the approach is well equipped to respond to the complexities of human life and human striving. So this theory, the capabilities approach, has gained wide influence in recent decades. It's been used for the United Nations Human Development Index, for the European Union and the OECD studies on poverty and social exclusion, and by the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, chaired by Sen and Joseph Stiglitz. So our research group, has used Sen and Stiglitz's 2009 report as the starting point for our current work, which is development of a social well-being index for Philadelphia, New York, and a couple other US cities. Their Sen and Stiglitz framework provides for us not only a practical way of measuring social well-being, but also a way out of the debate over the intrinsic versus the instrumental value of the arts that impact studies often provoke. So the question is no longer whether the arts promote well-being, but rather how do opportunities and access to the arts are a part of well-being. Just as you wouldn't talk about well-being without talking about health, food, housing, work, income, we can't talk about well-being without talking about arts and culture. That's the premise. It's a multidimensional premise. Our research demonstrates that the primary way the arts influence social well-being is through social interactions that they promote directly, and then social networks that they spawn as a result of these. In other words, the relationship of the arts to well-being is primarily the result of social, not individual processes. So in particular, a few examples, we found that neighborhoods with high density of cultural resources enhance residents' capabilities by increasing their freedom to choose whether or not to engage in the arts. And at the same time, not only do these cultural clusters foster cultural engagement, but they also contribute to the health and to other things like the health and affiliation capabilities of residents. So just with this little peek at the research, how can our experience grappling with capabilities, which is something we've done for a few years now, contribute to a discussion of ethical theory and the dilemmas of giving? We think a couple of ways. First, capabilities theory articulates a holistic approach to human development based on cross-cultural principles of social justice and centered on dignity and self-determination. So Amartya Sen sees poverty best understood as capability failure, heterogeneous failures of opportunity. Therefore, income and wealth are a means to an end, and capabilities are the end. Second, capabilities is a grounded theory that inspires an iterative approach to the formulation and practice of values-based decision-making. So in other words, good theory can shape values and mission that guides practice, and in turn, practice can inform and refine the values and mission that are driving the decision-making. Iterative. Third point, capabilities is an evolving theory that sparked international scholarship and shaped national and international development policy. So if we step back, just to conclude, if we step back, we can see that the explosion of social inequality is a major moral dilemma of our time. Philanthropy, in fact, exists as a product of the unequal distribution of wealth in society. It is therefore a moral responsibility as well as a unique opportunity to address social inequality and its consequences. From an ethical perspective, especially at the local level, philanthropy must assess its actions as well as its aspirations. As they say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And without further ado, Stelio, the floor is yours.
Good morning again. Thank you, Panos, for doing an excellent job with setting the framework of today's conversation. I think all the other panelists have done an excellent job in describing the general issues that one faces when you deal with the issue of philanthropy and ethics. Where to give, how much to give, how much of your endowment do you use, in which area of the world. There are a lot of questions like this, and I will not focus on any of these, but I will try to provide a concrete example of the issues that we are facing every day as a foundation, as a philanthropic institution, so that people can understand in a better way the ethical dilemmas that we have to deal with when we make decisions on how to provide support. Now, we are an international foundation, but we have a very strong mandate to do a lot of work to provide a lot of support in Greece. But we are nonetheless an international foundation, and every day we get proposals to provide support in a lot of different areas in the world. So let's start with this fundamental assumption. You have a country to which you have a strong mandate to provide support, Greece. which is currently under a lot of trouble. So Greece in this case is what I would call the child in the shallow pond. Remember this expression. And then you go home or you go to the office as a program officer and you get a proposal from a very remote place that you never heard before, from an organization that you never heard before, to provide support that will save the lives of a number of children. Okay? So this is the envelope, and you remember that expression again. So you're facing a basic dilemma here. Do you turn towards the country to which you have a strong mandate, or do you consider supporting an organization that you never heard before of in a very remote place? Do you do both? How much in one case and how much in the other? Now, many, many years ago, Peter Singer, the famous ethicist, came up with a very famous by now ethical puzzle, the puzzle of the shallow pond and the envelope. And this is the puzzle. You are going back home from work. You've just bought a very expensive suit. And as you walk going back home, you come upon a shallow pond where a child is drowning. What do? Do you jump? Remember, the pond is shallow. If you go into it, what can happen to you is you can ruin your 10,000 suit that you just bought. But there's no danger to your life. So do you do that? Do you go into the pond to save the child? Then you go home and you get an envelope. In this particular case was the Bengal Relief Fund to save lives of children overseas in India. Okay. What do you do with this envelope? Do you put it on your kitchen counter and you never look at it again? Do you open it immediately and decide to take action? What do you do? And Singer correctly identified the problem that if you decide to ignore the child that is drowning, it is probably, and I'm 100% sure, it's considered despicable to do so, unacceptable, that you won't jump into the pond to save the child. Now, if you decide to ignore the letter, that is not despicable. Nobody cares about that. You will not even think about it. It won't bother you. You won't even consider it again. But these ethically, these are exactly the same issues. There's no difference between these two things. In both cases, if you ignore what you have in front of you, it will end up in loss of life. Okay? But one is considered unethical, and the other, there's no problem with it. It's not ethical, but it's not unethical to the mind of most people. And in this case, you can say that Greece is the child in the shallow pond that is right next to you, and you have an obligation to jump into it and help. And the envelope is the proposal that you get from a remote part of the world to save people that you don't know, you don't have any connection with them, anything like that. Then let's go into something else. There is a very famous passage in Dickens's A Bleak House where the narrator accuses the protagonist, Miss Jellyby, and quote unquote, she could not see anything nearer from Africa. She was so concerned with those who were unfortunate abroad that she could not see the squalor and the destitute that was happening around her front door. She was fully occupied with helping people in Africa, far away, not concerned with what was happening right next to her. So again, in this case, the poverty, the destitute, the extreme conditions at home, one can say that today, for us as a philanthropic institution, is Greece. Africa is the proposal that we get from somewhere far away. And so what do you do again? And this is something that we discuss internally. This is a debate that we consider. You have to. As a philanthropic institution, you have to. And I would not tell you how one deals with it. I think it's something that you should consider. But I'll go back to a moral approach that, again, Peter Singer put forward many, many years ago. If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable importance, we ought to do it. So in this particular case, to me at least, if you can prevent something bad that is happening in another place of the world without sacrificing something comparable that is happening next to you, let's say the situation in Greece today, you ought to do it. The scale of it, how you divide, how you approach it, how much you give in one case, how much you give in another case, it's an internal debate. It's logistics at the end of the day. But the moral approach is that one, and I agree with it. Now, I want to quickly set a couple of more issues. For many of us as philanthropic institutions, the distance between us and the people in need that we ask to help every day is very large, even if these people are right next to you. In terms of social issues, economic issues, everything that you want to mention, there's an enormous distance between us providing support and those who are poor. You cannot deny that. And there are many obstacles in the middle of the road as you try to consider how to do this. Now, for many, many years, the way we provide support, not only us, but everyone actually, is one and the same. You decide, there are certain standards that you follow, you check the organization, you do a background check, you do this, you do that, and you provide support. A few years ago, two economists at MIT, the Global Poverty Lab, wrote a very important book, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, Poor Economics, a Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty. They did extensive research in the way organizations like us all over the world provide support for social causes. And the data proved clearly that the way we do things is not working. For a lot of reasons that we don't understand the landscape of those countries where we're providing support. There is a lot of corruption. There's a lot of money lost in the middle. The data clearly shows that the way as organizations that we do things is not really working. A lot of this money is not going where it should go. It's getting lost. And this is where an ethical dilemma comes into place. Do you continue to do things the way you do things just because everybody else is doing them and just because you have been doing them in the same way? Or do you decide to look into doing things differently when you know that you do provide support, let's say 60% of it goes where it should go, but 30, 40, 25, it doesn't because of the inherent obstacles that exist there. The distance, again, is too large. There's a lot of trouble navigating that landscape. And another one, and I will finish. There was a book that came out a week ago by a very distinguished New York University economist, William Easterly, called The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor, in which he makes a very important argument that a lot of organizations, whether it's the World Bank, USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a lot of the large foundations, provide a lot of support in third world countries that are not democratically ruled. There is a lot of corruption. So he makes the argument that we do this without at the same time trying to change the system. And he argues that democratic societies, transparency, absence of corruption is the only way really to help the poor. And if one continues to do things the way we do today, keep providing support for the poor in a corrupt environment, in a way you are providing a band-aid, nothing else. You're not changing the environment. You're not providing a long-term solution. And the argument here is the following, the ethical dilemma. Do you continue to follow your agenda as an organization, to do what you know how to do? Okay? You provide support in Ethiopia, where you know that there's a corrupt regime, where you know that people there are suffering more because of the corruption rather than the lack of support. or do you insist for systemic change? But then you get into another ethical dilemma, and that's policy. How much can philanthropic institutions get involved with policy and changing policy? Thank you.
So, Martyn, are these challenges that Stelios very elaborately put to the front some of the reasons why Carnegie Trust focuses its philanthropic giving to a specific region?
I think they're exactly it. There was, I'm reading a lot about the history of the First World War at the moment, and one of the major criticisms of those with power is something called strategic indecisiveness. They kind of did everything, but not enough in every single aspect. Not enough troops here, not enough investment there, not powerful enough alliances. The result was catastrophe. The dilemma for philanthropy, and I absolutely agree with Stelios here, is to take risks about how you're going to use your strategic investment to take decisions. Because if you spread too widely, you'll be a bystander, and actually damage might happen. Now, therein lies the biggest risk of all. All the ethics have to come out, you have to make a risk decision. If it goes wrong, your reputation is trashed. If you don't make that, you are inconsequential for all the cash that you have. And therein lies the central dilemma. You can do very little, pretending you're doing a lot, strategic indecisiveness, or you can do a lot and risk everything and maybe change the world or change part of it, or possibly destroy your organization. Now, I think it's a terrible dilemma to have for huge organizations, but it's at the heart of the discussion about ethics. So my line was, don't ask for an imposed ethic on you, think very strongly about your own ethics, and then apply that to your work with some confidence. And it is an amazing risk to take if you're doing this.
Jeff, stemming again from Stelios' points, let's say you have a mandate you have a global mandate, and you've identified a situation where you can spend a small sum of money but have a potential huge impact. How would you go about it? Would you hire a linguist?
Right. No, and it's hard. It's an important question about assessing the values of the people you're trying to help. Right. That's sort of the take-home message from my little example. I was very taken by Stelios, your reference to Peter Singer, and the challenge that Singer puts to us is how much is enough. Right. To put it very bluntly, and his answer, which I think is the one that Martyn is pointing to, is to say you should give until giving more would make you worse off than the people who need your help. Right now, that's a very high bar and a very difficult challenge, and it also has the effect of diluting the impact of philanthropy. I mean, that's sort of the challenge that Martyn is identifying. I don't know what the answer is. Obviously, that's why we're here at a conference in Athens trying to wrestle with these issues. I guess for me, the conclusion is, as Martyn just put it, don't wait for people to tell you what the answer is, but rather identify the goals, the values, the framework by which to make those decisions from an organizational perspective. And clarity about that, I think, is at least part of the step along the path to trying to answer this question.
I suggest we move on to the electronic questionnaire something that we did yesterday as well, and I think through these questions a number of issues will pop up and we can discuss them. So if we move on to the first question, so it's a philanthropic foundation should partner with 1, government, 2, the private sector, 3, government and the private sector, 4, none of the above. Start voting now and for the next 15 seconds. Okay, overwhelming agreement there. Martyn, I think that was one of your favorite questions. What do you make of it?
Well, I think this is a great audience to have. I wish you were like my trustees. I wish you were my trustees, because it is actually quite a difficult conversation we have at every board meeting. The degree to which we compromise our independence and in part compromise the ethics at Oxfam by engaging. And I think that we should do, but it's a very difficult task to do, because you have to have, I think, as we were saying, a very strong internal attitude. You have to know as an organisation why you're there and what compromises you're willing to make and why you're willing to make them. So I'm delighted with that response. It's much higher than I was expecting. Please come and join my board.
Chris, how does this make you feel? I mean, your presentation really highlighted some difficult issues there, at least in terms of cooperation with the private sector. Does this make your job easier or more difficult?
I think, yeah, I mean, it happens. It happens now, it happens everywhere, as I mentioned. I think what's interesting for me is the word partner, because partner can take many forms. And for example, we position ourselves with certain actors, certain multinationals in certain sectors as a critical friend, which is a fairly oblique term to mean that we're the chap next to you in the bar asking you to stop smoking because we love you. But you know, partnership can mean fundraising, you know, income, but it can also mean a convergence on different terms, and that doesn't need to mean that you're subservient to the other actor in that dynamic. And I think it's important to balance what leverage you have between the different actors within that relationship.
So let's move to the next question. Should the Philanthropic Foundation influence policies? I mean, this is a reformulation of the Spider-Man question, right? When Spider-Man's uncle was having his dying moments, he told Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And one of the themes in this panel today was that as philanthropic institutions take on more and more of the burden of a failed welfare state, you know, unavoidably they have more power. So that is the question, and you have two options, yes or no, and you can start voting now.
This is not do they, but should they?
Should they? Yeah, should they? Yeah.
Do they is obviously.
It's a different issue. That's what? Including, yeah, or general. Okay, at least it's not 50-50. So, Susan, in your presentation, you referred to the capabilities approach, and you said that, you know, empowering people is a means to an end. The end is actually having the capabilities. How would you feel about this? I mean, I would imagine you would be sympathetic to the yes question on this, to the yes answer on this?
Yes, but I wouldn't say should. I would say that philanthropy, to me, coming from as an outside in, to me, philanthropy is making policy, whether it wants to or not. It's the effect, the ethical dilemmas through practice and their effects on the ground are policy, whether it's de facto policy, it's policy without design, usually, or in some cases, some foundations will take a strategy. I think, at least in the United States, part of why this, that government foundation question, I don't know partner's the right word. I think the point is that the actions of the sectors that Martyn laid out are cumulatively, the policy is the effect of all those actions of people in power. That is policy, and everyone may have a separate policy. So I guess I think philanthropy should recognize that it is in the policy realm, want it or not, regardless of your board or the aspiration, and they should see what the effect of the grant making is and how it connects to their niche. The foundation's chosen niche, or where they can be effective or want to be effective. And I think the other side of the policy making is that your grantees, there's the bottom up side, that the philanthropy is part of the power structure of the civil society, and the other side of civil society are the grantees and the community ground-based groups. So I think you would want to be listening and have that help shape your policy.
Next question, please, is a foundation should provide support based primarily on need, effectiveness, and maximum impact, metrics, ethics. Start voting now, please. split opinion between need and effectiveness and maximum impact. Ethics is a distant third, I see. So, Nancy, what do you make of it?
So for me, ethics is completely wound up in the other elements. Ethics is not something in a vacuum, right? So ethics means you've done good, you've been effective, you've done that while you've paid attention to what the real problems are. And so in my worldview, the more we separate ethics, the less of an impact ethics really has. I want to relate this to this example that Stavros gave us with Peter Singer and the shallow pond and the envelope. On the one hand, those two examples are the same in terms of need and the depth of the problem, and presumably what a foundation has to think about is what needs and problems it cares about. But a difference there, which I think also was illustrated through your later comments, is where do I have confidence I will be effective? And the more data come out that say that so much of philanthropy is not effective, despite the best of intentions and despite a commitment to addressing the key problems, one thing you know with the kid in the shallow pond is that you're going to be effective. And in sending that letter, I don't mean to be dismissive about putting the envelope in the recycling, but one thing you're much less confident of is effectiveness. So it seems that devoting attention to understanding how to be effective in the areas one wants to be effective is going to be an important strategy in and of itself.
Can I say something? I mean, it's fascinating to me that metrics is 1.4% because this is a very important part of the debate, the philanthropic debate today. I mean, there are limited resources, and I think more and more people are paying more attention to metrics. And actually, this is becoming a debate of its own, to what extent numbers should determine how you allocate your resources and where you provide support. And again, it's a very intense debate. It used to be that metrics were kind of the picture at the beginning. Now the conversation is driven by metrics, but all of a sudden people are discovering that, you know, this is not black and white. There are a lot of other issues that come into play here, need, effectiveness, ethics. And it's interesting, like I think last week, again, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been pushing very strongly to provide, you know, to evaluate teachers in public high schools as a way of reforming education. And that was a very intense drive, but all of a sudden they discovered that it wasn't working. That drive had a lot of internal problems, and they put a moratorium. They came publicly a week ago and said there is a moratorium across the border in us evaluating and promoting, you know, providing support to school based on the assumption that they will evaluate their teachers. The way they were approaching just didn't work. So these are some of the examples that metrics can be a problem at the end.
I was going to speak to this question combined with the one before. So understanding of need is, I think, a very important aspect of this question, but need can be different things. So individuals in need, which I think is the way this question was probably understood, is different than need in an area where funding has been absent. So funding skews programs, which is sort of the point that we've heard from numerous people. And governments will focus in a particular area, leaving a need in a different area. So I think part of the way we have to think about ethics is what the appropriate distribution of resources is, which goes to this question of need and the public-private combination division of the pie, as Martyn was articulating. So you know, it's hard to access this with clickers and for different questions, but I think they're all very intertwined.
I wanted to say was within my own organisation, we went through this process where we were trying to distinguish between feeling good and doing good. And we had a lot of conversations where people said, I think this is where my moral stance is. And they felt good about that. But when we talked about doing good, it really challenged our moral stances. And that's where we've got to get to within philanthropy. If we are merely trying to say, I feel good by doing this, I think you haven't faced on the dilemmas that Stavros about doing good. And let me give you one example. We were quite certain that we were in favour of human rights, who wouldn't be, which are broadly rights against the state. And we were talking a lot about this. We all felt very good about that. And somebody says, what about the rights of citizens against their family and community, which is a very modern form of oppression, about how that happens in a huge range of societies across, across the world. We felt much less comfortable, personally, about this area, but it was something we thought we should be exploring. So we have been funding New York University and Gordon Brown, a former Prime Minister, to set up a commission, a global commission on citizenship to try to study this issue at a high level. But behind all of that, we think, well, shouldn't families have rights over their children? Shouldn't men having rights over women? These are really, really cross-cultural dynamics. And I just wanted to make this point that if we start thinking of ethics about how we feel as individuals working for philanthropy, we will fail to exercise all the responsibility, all the power that we have. We have to actually look at doing good and therefore face these ethical dilemmas.
So a panel on ethics that says you shouldn't think about ethics when you exercise philanthropy. Okay, next question. Philanthropy has ulterior motives for some kind of personal benefit. Correct? Incorrect? No opinion. Start voting now. Okay, so Stelio, I think you have to deal with this.
Well, it's too black and white again. I mean, I think, how do you define personal benefit? Personal benefit is, it can be just satisfaction and be proud about what you're doing. That's a personal benefit. That's a personal feeling. Does that mean that you should not have that? Again, I think it's, you have to, do you mean by personal benefit that it's a monetary benefit? Yeah, if that's the case, you should not. You should not do that. But if personal benefit means, making you feeling good about what you have done, yes, absolutely, I'm for it.
Next question. Philanthropy and ethics are synonymous and antithesis, complementary, or completely different notions. Start voting now. Okay, complementary, overwhelming support for that. Jeff, how do you see that this fits in with the rest of the responses we got?
Everybody's been listening to what we've been saying, which is a good thing. I say congratulations, you all passed the test. But, well, I hope this is true, and I hope we all on the panel would agree that they are complementary notions. But I think part of what you've been hearing some of us say is that it's difficult to, they should not be divorced. That we can't really talk about philanthropy without talking about ethics. And of course, that's the point of today's program and the value of having a discussion like this with a group of interested people like are in the room. So that's a heartening response, I guess I would say.
So time to open the floor to questions. So please raise your hand, identify yourselves by your name and the institutions you represent, so we can start. The lady here at the front.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ellen Brignotis. I'm a leadership and ethics teacher at American High School here in Athens. And my greatest challenge is helping young people to reestablish their trust and faith in the systems that are failing around them. And in my effort to encourage giving and contributing, being empathetic and active members of society, they question the effectiveness of philanthropy in really effectively impacting change. So my question is, how can I, as a teacher of our younger citizens, help them to find a way that they can be effective advocates of change without resorting to violent measures? We've all seen the Molotov cocktails here in Athens and are quite discouraged by them. So that's what I'm trying to find. How do I help them be effective advocates in their society?
Very important question. Who would like to address it? Martyn?
I think it's a fantastic question. And part of what I was doing this morning was meeting with a series of foundations talking about the concern the OECD has, the rich countries of the world, about the reducing trust in government and whether foundations have a role to play about bridging that gap between governments and civil society. My own view is we have a role to play. We've got to be very careful with this. But if we don't think that civil society, the voluntary associations of people, are at the heart of democracy rather than government, and philanthropy has a really strong role to play with building capacity in civil society about finding people's ability to help themselves, then we will not have a vibrant we will not have the vibrant democratic societies that Stavros was talking about. So the role we have to play is quite distant, I would say. It's about continuing to build the institutions of civil society as they've been degraded by actually quite an overpowering state apparatus since 1945, broadly in Western society. So we've got to readdress that question, but there's no simple answer, and definitely philanthropy can't do it by themselves. But philanthropy has a lot of impact in schools. It can work on programs. It must find that way. But I personally believe that only by being active can young people actually understand the world around them. And encouragement to be active in their world is something, the great thing that philanthropy can do. That encouragement to be part of civil society so you can have real impact. And we do that fairly well, but we don't do it well enough, I think.
So your answer would be essentially, in one word, volunteerism, so to speak, or not? Well,
if I confine it to volunteerism, it's as though somebody else is confining them. I think the stuff we had yesterday about the future of Greece being in the hands of young people, about the Stavros being the engine by which you can delve economy, it needn't be volunteerism. You can actually create your own civil society institutions. Where I come from, I live in a house built by a civil society organisation. I bank with a civil society bank was founded in the 19th century. There's a whole range of things we did 2 centuries ago. We have to re-find the ability. I think our new generations are refining that through social networks. They're building things I don't recognise myself as civil society, but which are new forms of civil society. The danger with that, it becomes a rather passive mechanism. That's always the danger with social media. You just engage via technology, not in real terms. But I think there's a building blocks there myself, not just volunteering, building your own new forms of voluntary association. And young people, I think, are doing that.
Questions? Lady on the right, Eva.
Hello, my name is Eva Polizogopoulou from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. I would like to focus on the first question answered by the audience today. We saw that the majority voted that a foundation should collaborate with the state and the private sector as well. However, there was a 10% who voted that a foundation shouldn't collaborate with any of the two. So my question is, how do you explain that answer and whether you find it alarming or not? Thank you.
Chris, would you like to address that?
I think from what Susan was saying, I think that there's an issue there, which is it's happening anyway. And I'm certainly not a politics major, but as soon as you're pointing to the duty of care that one person has towards another, you're in politics. So I think it's the question was interesting in that it's happening. You have power, the other actors have power, and it's unavoidable. So it's in that sense, it's a question that's impossible to. You can't ever disaggregate yourself from working with governments or with the private sector. I remember there's a number of NGO organisations who say we do not work with the private sector. So, for example, Greenpeace, but it implicitly does. It has to exist. It has to have suppliers. It has to move its people from one place to another. So it's already involved in the private sector in some way, shape or form. So there's a bit of an impossibility about the question. So I suppose the answer is, do you have an explicit agenda, or should you have an explicit agenda to do so, which I think is a different question.
Vello?
I mean, I think that the interesting thing to know in this case is why 10% of the audience would say that no to the private sector, not to the public sector. And I have a feeling that this is because there is a profound mistrust here in Greece, at least, both for the public and the private sector. So that probably drives that answer But you have to know why people voted that way in order to understand it. But I think if you know the numbers tell you something. Although philanthropic activity has increased tremendously, the percentage of funds that go into, to provide support are very, very small in comparison to anything else. Although foundations are very wealthy, their wealth is very small if you compare it to the overall economy. So it cannot be done on its own. No foundation on its own can provide an impactful solution to problems without collaborating with the public or the private sector. And it's just a matter of numbers at the end of the day, nothing else.
Next question. The gentleman at the back.
Thank you. This is a fascinating panel, extremely appropriate for the occasion. My name is James Wright, and I'm the director of the American School of Classical Studies, which includes the Gennadius Library here in Athens. I want to follow up on the preceding questions. As an institution, we've been here for 133 years, but we are a guest institution in the country. And we debate among ourselves, should our actions here as a philanthropic, cultural, and education and research institution serve according to our own ethical standards, policies, and practices, and thereby serve as a model, as a kind of oasis for people to demonstrate ways of doing things, when they in fact are cultural practices that are derived largely out of American cultural practices for educational and philanthropic institutions? Or should we engage more directly with the governmental institutions that we interact with? That includes also educational institutions, and try to affect change according to our own perceptions? Or is that, it gets to the question that's been discussed here, and the real question I guess I put is it hopelessly naive to think that an institution can be a change agent within a setting where there are cultural practices that are deeply ingrained within the structure of a country?
Thank you. Nancy, would you like to address this?
Well, it's such a great question, and I'll start with a disclaimer that this is so not my expertise. So I'll throw out an idea that occurs to me in listening to you, but you can probably answer the question better than I can. It seems to me that a theme that we keep hearing is that you sort of have to know what you stand for, and in certain ways what your highest priorities are. So there's a series of values that your institution may have and that you model, and yet you're also appreciate the importance of partnering and the importance of having what you stand for be broader. So it seems to me that two thoughts. The first is really understanding what ends up being your highest priority, because sometimes they conflict with each other. And sort of what do you really stand for is going to be important. And then I'm also a really big believer in risk-taking and measurement as a check and balance. So it may be that at a certain point, you get as much information as you can, you do your best, and then you jump in and you think in advance about what are we going to find in 2 years that are going to make us say continue or stop, and have that conversation in advance. And there's certain things we can only figure out, I think, through risk-taking and measurement.
Can I?
Jeff?
So I'd love to talk to you, maybe not this way, but after the session. And one of the questions I would love to hear you talk about is whether the kinds of change you'd like to make are because you perceive there to be some unethical behavior in the context in which you are working, or whether it's more like we think this is the right way to do it and we would like more people to think that way as well. Americans have been accused, sometimes rightly, of being ethical imperialists. We would like to impose what we take to be our values on others, and that seems to be a sort of bad justification. So that would be the question I would ask in a very blunt way back to you, and I would hope that there's some commonality that cuts to the core of this problem of relativism, and that we share values, and it's rather an interpretation or a way we act upon those values that's different, rather than a difference in what the values are. I hope that's the answer.
Martyn, you would like to add something?
It is a fascinating question. My experience is this. I work for a UK organisation that also covers Ireland because we were set up in 1913. Over the period from 1913 to 1930s, Ireland had a violent revolution against the UK and broke away. We are still there, but highly sensitive to the idea that we're a UK organisation still working in Ireland. My take is this: in Ireland, which has very, very severe economic impacts, similar to, not quite so severe as yours, but similar to Greece and here, is that the perception is government failed to protect citizens from the failure of markets. And therefore, both governments and the private sector are not in any way trusted. They can't provide the leadership. Can philanthropy substitute for that leadership? Of course it can't. It is not possible to substitute for that leadership. What it can do is help rebuild that trust where appropriate. And it comes back to Nancy's point. If you don't know what your own values are, you're not going to be very helpful. You're going to be caught between all sorts of different stresses. If you do know what your values are, you have the possibility of making change with others, but you risk being isolated and ridiculed. And I think those are the risks that you have to take.
We are about 4 minutes over our allocated 1 hour and 20 minute slot, so we'll take one more question from the hand down there. Sorry, I can't see you very well. Hello.
Good morning. My name is Grace Christovasilis. I represent the Falco Foundation. A lot of what you've discussed today, many points that you've made, were brought up just a week ago by the UN High Commissioner Guterres in his statement, where they talked about over 50 million are now displaced asylum seekers and refugees, more than post-World War II. The first question goes to Susan. It's two questions, sorry about that. Susan Seifert, when you talk about capabilities approach, when you talk about the arts and culture, and you try to weigh which is more important, you talked about using that approach towards several cities, including New York. Have you looked at the refugee population? The second question is because Mr. Vasilakis mentioned about, and one of the questions was about how philanthropy can affect policies. They talked about, well, first question first. The humanitarian solution doesn't exist. Guterres said the solution is political. Humanitarian organizations can only do so much to mitigate the impact of conflict on ordinary people. And the UN World Food Program has already been forced to ration their food in some of the refugee camps. They talk about philanthropy affecting policies, that the peace deficit represents an incapacity of the international community to prevent the conflict and to find solutions. First to Susan and whoever else might want to make comments on it.
Typically the way we look is we look at geographic community, so it's a socially, economically integrated community, and rather than a specific population group. Although we did do a Philadelphia study, a pilot study on migrants in Philadelphia, including immigrants, migrants, internal, as well as refugees. And we were looking at the concept as what we called arts-based social inclusion. We wanted to know if it was, we sort of made it up as a hypothesis and then went and did interviewing around this concept with people working with immigrants and how they used culture or the arts in the context of other services. And I would say we validated the concept, and ideally we would do more work in that vein. And that will feed into this social well-being. I mean, I would say immigrants and refugees are, internal migrants are, the integration of arts across all the health, housing, employment is even more important, more meaningful, I would say, based on our work.
Comment on the second question?
Sure that I understood your question clearly. Are you talking about the fact that you have to change policy, it is necessary to do so? Is that the question, that a foundation has to be concerned with that?
I think one of the questions was, can philanthropy affect policies?
Yes.
And so the example that Guterres is saying is that, no, can happen. And so I wanted to know.
Can or cannot?
Cannot happen. It's past that phase now because of the dangerous situation that the peace deficit exists in many countries. So I wanted to know.
Well, he's using a very pragmatic and realistic approach about a fact on the ground. I think you have to consider policy at some point if you want to change things to a large scale, but I'm very uncomfortable in advocating that a foundation should be involved absolutely with policy changes because, again, it's not so black and white. We like it when George Soros puts, certain propositions on the ballot, but we don't like it when the Koch brothers put other propositions on the ballot that are more conservative. So this is a ground that is not completely straight, that it's very shifty. So you have to be very careful. And the whole policy issue is very, very complicated. And I don't think that foundations can get fully involved with policy because then they get involved with politics. And that's, again, tricky ground.
Well, thank you all very much for your patience. We hope you found the panel interesting. Same goes for our panelists. Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of the conference.